After filmmaker Christopher Nolan broke off his partnership of more than 20 years with Warner, because he didn't agree with the release of his latest film, Tenet, simultaneously in theaters and on streaming, he looked for a new home to finance this new film and was welcomed by Universal. And what was that experience like? I'll tell you now. Robert Oppenheimer was a theoretical physicist who was given the opportunity by the US government to put his studies into practice by leading the Manhattan Project, which would give rise to the first atomic bombs the world had ever seen. I think Cillian Murphy is a very interesting actor. He has a hyper-communicative eye and an enviable stage presence. But even though these things make him add a lot to the works he takes part in, his compositions don't tend to stand out so much, either because they're discreet, or because he has a more secondary role, or because charisma may not be his strong suit. That's why, when they do play more eye-catching characters, they're usually villains. And then the man dominates, as he knows how to create a stern, intimidating look, a disturbed and disturbing smile at the same time, and a face of few friends. That is a beauty. As we've seen in Nolan's Batman films, Night Flight, and even in the cold and calculating Peaky Blinders series. In fact, this series was one of the few opportunities he had to star in a major project. I'm not excluding Exterminio or Sunshine. But even so, I don't think any of these projects can compare to the golden opportunity Christopher Nolan gave him with Oppenheimer. The film has a huge cast, full of big stars, with many surprises, including many nominees and winners of the Golden Globe. And even though some characters have their own arc, with their own goals, they're all designed to revolve around Cillian Murphy's character, to which the actor dedicates a performance that doesn't try to be a goody-goody, doesn't demand strutting or other kinds of flashy mannerisms. All that's required, which isn't all that much, is a sober interpretation with a lot of stage truth to communicate all the ethical dilemmas and their consequences that the character will go through. The actor is a master at this. And so he seized this opportunity with all his might to carry the narrative with absurd confidence. In this case, interpretative security. Because the character is going to go through many tensions caused by insecurity about his participation in the creation of the atomic bomb. These feelings are conveyed by the actor's expressive eyes. And even though he is very economical, his grief never fails to be extremely clear and frank in our eyes. Which is essential for this movie. After all, Oppenheimer is talking about the theoretical discovery of the atomic bomb. He talks about the US project determined to build the bomb before its opponents. He also talks about the paranoia against communism that led to the Cold War. It also talks about the first and most striking nuclear attacks that wiped out hundreds of thousands of people in Japan. But although it talks about all this, it's not a movie about it. It's a movie about the guy who conducted the studies and directed the project that created the atomic bomb. No wonder it's called Oppenheimer and not atomic bomb. And to tell you the truth, this path seemed much more interesting to me. Surprisingly interesting, given that it's a Christopher Nolan movie, which always seems to me to be a filmmaker more interested in situations than in actually studying characters. He may have studied here or there, but that wasn't his focus. And it's good that he went against his background and decided to try something new, precisely with this story, which receives a mature treatment from the author as he seeks to understand the father of the atomic bomb by portraying all aspects of the guy's personal and professional life, issues that led to numerous moral and political judgments later on. These, in turn, are re-evaluated by the film, but without the work assuming a judgmental role. Although it does present a somewhat welcoming view of what is portrayed. But regardless of this, the main aim of the project is really to put all the data on the table so that we have an in-depth understanding of the subject of Oppenheimer. Because let's face it, the man went through some really complicated situations. Can he be criticized? Certainly. And as the movie points out, he suffered many. But even so, complicated because of the various personal, social, professional, and civic dilemmas that sometimes intersected and had consequences for his life and the way he would be remembered by history. You see, as a theoretical scientist he is faced with the possibility of advancing his studies and putting some of his theories to the test. The problem is that in order to do so, he would have to create a weapon of mass destruction that would be at the disposal of his country's government. And there's no way it couldn't be done that way, since it's not a little experiment that he could do in the back of a garage. The business would require a huge investment that only the government of a powerful country could afford. And of course the government wouldn't invest for nothing. It would want to use the discovery to improve its military power and show the world what it was capable of, so that it could continue imposing its will on the rest of the world without much resistance. But if Robert Oppenheimer didn't do it, the idea was already in the air. Someone would do it. So even as an act of self-preservation, if a government was going to dominate the invention, it had to be the government of his country, mainly because there was a risk that the Nazis could do it. Then, as a minimal compensation, he would later try to use his influence to reduce the damage that his work would inevitably cause. But even so, the compensation would be minimal. And this weight on his conscience would accompany him for the rest of his life. And even afterwards, since even today there are those who condemn him for his decisions. I myself believe that the man entered an unsolvable dilemma. Even though he was vain, even self-centered, and wanted to make the discovery himself, there was much more at stake that motivated his persistence. A complex panorama, but one that I believe the film has managed to expose very effectively, very intelligently, even through a tremendously difficult and challenging narrative. Starting with the rapid-fire dialogues that mix themes from personal, social, professional, scientific, and political spheres. And often, without much warning as to when it moves from one topic to another. At first, the confusion this creates is even greater. But then, as certain relationships are established, the themes become clearer because we can understand the patterns. Ah, with this person he talks about this. With this other person, he talks about that. Now, what's complicated is that new characters keep arriving in this business. And even though this is very realistic because our lives are like this, constantly crossed not only with those in our standard cycle, but there's always someone new, different, interfering. On the other hand, this amount of people is capable of knotting up our thinking. Not least because, not satisfied with this kind of confusion, Nolan reinvented himself by making a character study. But one thing he still hasn't let go of is messing with the chronology of events. I even think Darren Aronofsky should make a movie about Nolan's obsession with time. And if you understood that comment, yes, you're a movie buff and don't be ashamed of it. Being a movie buff is cool, people. Okay, but back to the point. There are various snippets of the life of the person portrayed, and it's not always clear which part we're seeing. There's even a segment that stands out because the photography used black and white. But I don't think this is necessarily used to highlight a time frame. But rather, another perspective. When black and white comes into play, we start to follow the perspective of Robert Downey Jr.'s character. Even having his perspective portrayed plays a fundamental role in representing Oppenheimer's persecution. With accusations of being a Soviet spy, of having passed information to Stalin, and so on. And then Van Foutry comes along and digs into the man's past to question any involvement he might have had with the left or communists. But as we get to know Robert Downey Jr.'s character, we discover his real motives for pursuing Oppenheimer. And whatever it is, I won't reveal it. It was bound to be an absurd caricature. But Downey Jr.'s interpretation gives it a monstrous humanity. It's a reprehensible attitude on his part, but still very human. Okay, but apart from this black and white distinction to separate the perspectives, we keep going back and forth in time. And the best we can do to decipher when it's happening is in the details of the protagonist's costume, makeup, and haircut, for example. There must be a logical coherence in the editing. On some occasions, I was even able to correlate things. Once the text got into a theme, I would jump back in time to portray that same theme at another time. Sometimes remembering, sometimes evaluating the consequences. But I'm not going to play the intellectual here. And I'll confess that, a lot of the time, I was a little lost as to the order of the facts. That's why this is a montage that I couldn't praise on a first viewing. I'd really have to see it again to be convinced. And so I can't say that it's a fault of the movie either. After all, there's a good chance that the perception of chronology isn't as important as it is in other, more standard films. Perhaps what came before what isn't so decisive in the telling of the story. Perhaps the most important thing is the perception we have of the character and how his persona and his dilemmas are forming in our box. And perhaps that's why the order chosen was ideal for this formation of ideas. What's more, in an equally subversive way, the movie doesn't end when the main plot does. After it, the narrative stretches on for a long time, focusing on the repercussions of Robert Oppenheimer's choices throughout his life. His associations, his ideologies and even his devotion to his country are called into question. And again at this point, I wondered if this excerpt was as important as the one we'd just seen. You see, in a work about a bomb, this epilogue would be excessive. It would be too much, it would be unnecessary. But this isn't a movie about the bomb, as I've already pointed out. It's a movie about its creator. And in that case, yes, it's very important that we have an idea of the consequences of his life, with a kind of political persecution after the first bombs went off. The more I think about Oppenheimer, the more convinced I am that I really liked what I saw. But I can't help wondering if he needed to be that complicated. And that's a word I've handpicked. It seems to me that sometimes Christopher Nolan is trying to do just that, complicate things. Sometimes there's a feeling that, perhaps, out of ego, he's trying to make his film even more intellectual than its subject matter demands. But that seems very controversial to me. Because that would alienate the audience. Whereas Nolan seems to me to be a filmmaker interested in attracting audiences and that, because he makes expensive and extravagant films, he needs to keep attracting large audiences in order to keep making expensive and extravagant films. So it's more likely that his intention to complicate things is more artistic and genuine. And really, that's what I believe after a bit more thought. I believe that your main intention was to create an exercise in language to make us activate our attention as much as possible and, with this expanded attention, make us more susceptible to the sensory experience that the film also seeks to provide. In addition to everything I've already said about the filmmaker's experiments, his direction was even more daring and intrigued me. Even though it's a drama, he decided to apply many of the resources he usually uses in action films. There's the soundtrack, which, although omnipresent, isn't the offensive type that tries to set a tone. But with its hum alone, it's dedicated to provoking anxiety and disturbing the viewer's judgment, in a good way. At one point, the mix even prioritizes the soundtrack's drones over the dialogues. There's also the micro-editing, which differs from the other one I've already mentioned because here I'm referring to specific scenes that are often energetic, as if a lot were happening on stage and not just mere dialogues. In addition, at a certain key moment, he uses a parallel montage characteristic of Nolan's films, which even intersperses these moments and evolves them simultaneously to maintain the suggestion of tension in progression. In addition to photography that is more spectacular than the standard for a drama film, the expensive production design in the composition of the city of Los Alamos, the extraordinary practical effects that complement and refer to explosions and the mix that gives the film a very grandiose tone. All of this kind of gave Oppenheimer's film an action movie look, even though there is no action involved here. Perhaps to some it may seem that the filmmaker is Making too much fuss for too little. But even so, I can't help noticing the value of this exercise in language and the fact that this set of elements makes Oppenheimer's work one with an absurdly authorial identity. A very good film, which left me very reflective and thoughtful about the director's choices and which made me strongly re-establish the connection I had with the filmmaker that had been lost. Not that I thought his last few films were bad, but I didn't think they were good enough for me to love. And with this movie we can start talking about nominations for the 2024 Golden Globe, huh? Right now I'm betting that it should go in as the best Cillian Murphy movie with actor Downey Jr. as supporting actor, sound, editing, photography. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it also got in for adapted screenplay, visual effects, production design, soundtrack, and Emily Blunt as supporting actress. These are weaker bets, but that's because as the race is just starting, these are the categories that are being targeted. But I'd say at least 6 nominations should win the day. So that's it, another InShot is coming to an end. I'm very grateful for your attention. Thank you very much. See a message from our sponsors before you go. See you next time and
If you
bye.
suffer or are afraid of ever developing cancer, I know you keep wondering, what will become of me? Will I be alive tomorrow? Will one day, will the pharmaceutical industry be able to create a solution to my problem? One thing I assure you, this industry is not worried at all about you. Think with me, why do you think technology involves? The sciences involved, medicine itself involves. And we still don't have a solution to this old problem, fortunately along with my team. We have gathered more than 100 definitive forms to beat cancer, some of them 10,000 times more effective than the conventional way. Do you want access to this list? Then click on the link and come find out. The link will be fixed in the comment.